I'd like to share today in this message how the world is inching ever closer, year by year, to a period of global mass deception that will eventually hasten Christ's return. The title today, World Traditions Entering 2022. World Traditions Entering 2022. It was about 10 years ago when I was speaking on a similar topic. It was probably even 20 years ago, the year 2000. I was thinking by reading different literature on where Christianity, mainstream Christianity, was trending in the world today. I would say Christianity is at a crossroads, between not growing anymore, but in decline. And now I could look back and say, well, it's past its crossroads. Here are a couple of statistics on that. Europeans have very little interest or time for religion nowadays, even though Europe is predominantly professing Christianity. The Pew Research Center reported in 2018 that in England, just 10% of adults say that religion is very important to them. France and Germany, 11% and 10% respectively, say that religion has really any import in their lives. China, the most populous nation on earth, 1.4 billion people live in China. 3% of adults polled say that religion has any place in their lives. Of course, it's a communist country. The state is the religion in those kinds of countries. A U.S. survey of the same question showed 53%, again, this was in 2018, 53% say that religion is actually important to them, but in reality, only 37% of Americans attend church regularly. So more people say that they are religiously oriented than they actually practice it, at least outwardly. As far as the sentiments in European countries among those who call themselves Christians but don't attend church at all or only a few times a year, their concept of truth will only more and more get more separated from what the Bible truth and reality is. Here's a quote from the Pew Research Center study, which involved 24,000 telephone interviews and randomly selected adults, including nearly 12,000 non-practicing Christians. Again, one definition for non-practicing Christians were those that don't attend church or very rarely do. It finds that Christian identity remains a meaningful marker in Western Europe, even among those who seldom go to church. Here's a quote. Although many non-practicing Christians say they don't believe in God as described in the Bible, they do tend to believe in some higher power or some spiritual force. And so, here's another quote from ChristianHeadlines.com. This is in an article posted last month, October 14th, by George Barna, the Senior Research Fellow for the Center of Biblical Worldview at the Family Research Council. Here's what George Barna reported on a similar subject. He said, the United States is in the midst of a worldview crisis that impacts every other issue facing the country today. Quote, a lot of people are walking around America today self-deceived about their worldview. The dominant worldview in America is syncretism, which involves picking and choosing elements from different worldviews. A little Eastern religion here, a little Islamic religion here, a little Shinto, a little Maoist, a little this and that, and mix it all together, and that's what I believe. That's what some people, many more Americans are moving in that direction. The result, I'm still quoting, Americans' worldviews often include beliefs that conflict and contradict one another. All total, 88% of American adults hold to syncretism. 88% of United States American public that has any kind of interest in religion at all are mixing their religions up and getting confused in contradictory ideas. Please turn with me to Matthew 24, verse 5, as we open our Bibles. Matthew 24, verse 5. That is a lead-in to what does God show us that is coming on the horizon before the end of the age, before Christ returns, in the end of the age. Matthew 24, verse 5, the Bible reveals a time of mass religious deception, so great that if it were possible, it would deceive even the elect. Let's read. Matthew 24, starting in verse 3. The disciples came to him privately, saying, "Tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" Verses 4 and 5. And Jesus answered and said to them, "Take heed that no one deceives you. For many will come in my name, saying, 'I am the Christ,' and will deceive many." Now come down to verses 14 and 15 with me. We're still in Matthew 24. Verse 14, "And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world as a witness to all nations, and then the end will come. Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, spoken of by Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, whoever reads, let him understand. And let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains." I pause here and mention that this is a very geographic specific crisis that I mentioned in a recent sermon, that when he's talking to his disciples sitting there on the Mount of Olives in that location, he's talking about a time of crisis that impacts them the most. And what does he say to them to do? Verse 17, "Let him who is on the housetop not go down to take anything out of his house. Let him who is in the field not go back even to grab his clothing. But woe to those who are pregnant and those with nursing babies in those days, and pray that your flight, your escape, may not be in the winter or on the Sabbath." Verse 21, he expands a little more on it. "For then at that time will be great tribulation, such as has not been since the beginning of the world until this time, no, nor ever shall be again." Verse 22, "And unless those days were shortened, no flesh would be saved, but for the elect's sake, those days will be shortened. And if anyone says to you, 'Look, here's the Christ,' or 'Look over there,' do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will rise and show great signs and wonders to deceive, if possible, even the elect." That is the comforting statement for those who study, who pray, who watch, who keep themselves ready, and who keep their spiritual garments clean. Verse 25, he says, "See, I've told you beforehand." Now, I won't go into verses 36 through 44, but that describes, as Jesus says, it will be like it was in the days of Noah, people eating and drinking and giving in marriage and not being aware, not following carefully the signs of the times, the danger signs of the times. And what does that mean? It means the world will be ripe for mass deception. The world will be ripe for mass deception. Skip down to verse 44. Jesus ends his short answer to his disciples with this: "Therefore you also be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour you do not expect." Now, with that background and that foundation, please turn with me to Revelation. Let's spend some time in the book of Revelation on this topic of mass deception coming on the world. Let's go to Revelation 13 and verse 8 together. Revelation 13, verse 8. Now we know and understand that Satan has an insatiable desire to be worshipped. And he cloaks himself from the world, so most of the world doesn't know that they're worshiping Satan. But in reality, all the pagan religions, all the false gods, all the idol worship is worshiping Satan. He loves it. He craves it. He will do anything he can to not lose that supremacy and that recognition that he craves so much. And so God is going to, at a particular time frame or gradually, release the constraints on Satan that had probably held him back for hundreds, if not thousands of years from doing more of his craft in deceiving humanity. He will pull back, and I'll show you a scripture that points to that shortly here, but God will allow the great lying signs and wonders before the end of the age to be wrought by Satan. In prophecies to be fulfilled, we know that there are two dominant world leaders that come on the scene. We haven't seen them yet. We don't know who they are. We haven't recognized them yet. One is known as the Beast, a political leader rising out of Europe, and the other is known as the false prophet, also a prominent figure. He's also called the second beast, a very charismatic religious leader that the world will recognize when the time is right, when God allows it. In John's vision in Revelation, he saw that these two men worked together in unison to deceive the nations. I won't turn, but Revelation 16, verse 13, it talks about these two, the beast and the false prophet. In vision, John sees these unclean spirits coming out of their mouths in words that look like frogs. Again, that's a vision that John saw. He saw all kinds of startling imagery in his vision. Let's go to verse 8, Revelation 13, verse 8. It tells us, all who dwell on the earth will worship him, the beast, whose names have not been written in the book of life, of the Lamb slain from the foundation of the world. Now, whose names are written in the book of life? Those who are faithful and who keep the gospel of God, the faith of Jesus Christ, and obedience toward God the Father. Verse 13 talks about this false prophet or this second beast who will be able to perform these marvelous, stunning, tremendous miracles that will deceive all but the very elect. Verses 13 and 14, let's read. He performs great signs so that he even makes fire come down from heaven on the earth in the sight of men. And he deceives those who dwell on the earth by those signs which he is granted to do in the sight of the first beast. I interjected the word first beast here. Telling those who dwell on the earth to make an image to the first beast who was wounded by the sword and lived. Now, you will read literature from other churches that teach prophecy and that this is an actual human being that might have been killed and then he comes back to life, or mortally wounded or seriously wounded and comes back to life. But let's be very cautious in concluding that it's an actual person. But the imagery could be speaking of a system like the final resurrection of the ancient Holy Roman Empire that is revived, and that making an image to this beast doesn't necessarily mean raising or erecting a metal statue or a wooden statue to this person either, to honor him. So let's keep a broad perspective of this beast who was wounded by the sword and lived. But nonetheless, the false prophet brings attention to this beast, and it does say that there will be an image made to the first beast. Now, the book of Revelation indicates that this religious leader, the second beast, the false prophet, will arise from Rome. Let's skip over to verse 17. And let's move over to chapter 17, verse 8. Chapter 17, verse 8. Here in John's vision, it showed a woman riding on a beast that has 7 heads and 10 horns. Verse 8, the beast that you saw, Jesus Christ is speaking to John in the vision. The beast you saw, John, and is not, and will ascend out of the bottomless pit and go into perdition. And those who dwell on the earth will marvel, whose names are not written in the book of life from the foundation of the world, when they see the beast that was and is not and yet is. You see, the imagery lends itself to a system of governance that is revitalized. It is brought back into world prominence and domination again. We'll talk about that in a few more minutes. Verse 9, the 7 heads is interpreted. They are 7 mountains on which the woman rides or sits. Rome is historically known as the city that sits on 7 hills as a reference point. Jump back to verse 1, Revelation 17, verse 1. It tells us a little more about this woman. She is the great harlot who sits on many waters. Verse 15 tells us what the many waters means. Verse 15. We're still in Revelation 17, verse 15. The waters which you saw where the harlot sits are peoples, multitudes, nations, and tongues. She sits on many waters. Verse 18, the woman, here, a woman symbolically depicting a geographical space or place, namely that great city of Rome, as it sits on 7 mountains or hills. So you put pieces of this puzzle together, and you see a system in Rome, and the identifier of the woman is given. And the woman whom you saw is that great city, which reigns over the kings of the earth. So our best understanding is this is Rome that is in the forefront of this prophecy. Back up to verse 5. The woman in this symbolism also depicts a church or a religious system. Verse 5, it says, and on her forehead a name was written, Mystery Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and of the abominations of the earth. John says in verse 6, I saw the woman drunk with the blood of the saints and with the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. There's a long history of the Roman Catholic Church and the centuries of persecution against other Christians that were faithful in following what the Bible says and not following so many of the edicts of human beings and the laws that the Catholic Church made that suffered with the loss of their lives and martyrdom. And so this mother of harlots or mother of prostitutes depicts a great false church. And it's also described as the mother over daughter churches. Many daughters she has. And of course we understand that to be 500 years ago with the Reformation, the many Protestant church organizations that split away from the Catholic Church and yet did not follow, and they didn't finish their understanding of separation from all of those Roman Catholic edicts. Sunday worship being right at the forefront of that. Sunday worship, which the Protestant religions still hold as their day of worship. So anyway, what ultimately becomes of this very short-lived, world-dominating religious system? Verse 1, back up to verse 1 of Revelation 17. Then one of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls came and talked with me, saying, Come, I will show you the judgment of the great harlot who sits on many waters. Then you jump over to verse 16 now and see what that judgment is. Verse 16, and the 10 horns which you saw on the beast, these will hate the harlot, make her desolate and naked, and eat her flesh and burn her with fire. These 10 groups of nations or 10 blocks of geographic leadership that lend all their power for a short period of time to this beast power will turn on this beast system, turn on it, and attack it. We don't have all the details yet of how that happens, but that's what we're told. Now, please hold a place in Revelation. We're going to come back here later And if you would, come over to 2 Thessalonians 2 and verse 3 with me. 2 Thessalonians 2 and verse 3. The Apostle Paul here clearly warns that one of the greatest deceptions to occur at the time of the end under this great religious system that is being built up comes about by what he called the lawless one. The lawless one. Let's read 2 Thessalonians 2, verses 3 and 4. Let no one deceive you by any means, for that day will not come unless the falling away comes first, and the man of sin is revealed, the son of perdition, the son of destruction, the one earmarked for destruction. That's what this means, perdition. Verse 4, who opposes and exalts himself above all that is called God or that is worshipped, so that he sits as God in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. Very presumptuous. Now, have others done this? Yes, others have in history, but on a global scale, no, not to the degree that we have yet ahead. Who is this man of sin? What's the Bible say about him? He's equated with an Antichrist figure, and the Apostle John now is the only biblical author to use the word Antichrist. And he uses it, I believe, 4 times in his messages. It seems to identify the same individual that Paul is talking about, describing the false prophet. All right, I won't turn, but 1 John, here 2 cases. 1 John 2, verse 22, John labels anybody who denies the Father and the Son as an Antichrist. An Antichrist. Then 2 John 1, verse 7, he calls somebody who doesn't acknowledge that Jesus Christ came in the flesh is a deceiver and an Antichrist. So it's a general term that the Apostle John gives to person who denies the authenticity of Jesus Christ, who denies the Father. Now, 1 John 2, verse 18, John takes a different approach, and he identifies a particular person at the end of this age. 1 John 2, verse 18, little children, it's the last hour, and as you have heard that the Antichrist is coming. Even now, many Antichrists have come, by which we know it that it is the last hour. In a number of New Testament passages, you can get a sense that the apostles really did feel that before their lives came to an end, Jesus Christ would probably return in their age. This is one case here. Otherwise, you might say, what do you mean it's the last hour? But 2,000 years have gone by. But this was an impression that Jesus Christ and the Father had allowed the apostles to have that anticipation, the expectation kept alive, the enthusiasm, the zeal of God's people to be kept stirred up. Let's continue now in 2 Thessalonians 2, verse 5. Paul's still talking about this lawless person. Do you not remember that when I was still with you, I told you these things? And now you know what is restraining, that he may be revealed in his own time. God is holding Satan back for millennia, perhaps, if you will, for his unleashing to be able to take the communication, the technology, the ability to cross between cultures and languages and see a global system and a global power, a global network like never before in human history. And Satan will utilize these new tools that weren't available even 100 years ago for mass deception. And God will release or open the door for Satan to do this. We'll see why shortly. It says, verse 7, still Paul speaking, 2 Thessalonians 2:7, for the mystery of lawlessness is already at work. Only he, God, who now restrains, will do so until God steps out of the way. And when the lawless one will be revealed, whom the Lord will consume with the breath of his mouth and destroy with the brightness of his coming. Verse 9, the coming of the lawless one is according to the working of Satan, again, with all power, signs, and lying wonders, and with all unrighteous deception among those who perish. And here's the answer why. Because they did not receive the love of the truth, that they might be saved. The drift away from this book we're holding, this precious book in our laps, by the world as a whole, of even mainstream Christian professing people. I'm not even talking about the Hindus, the Buddhists, the Muslims, and the other religions of the world. I'm talking about those that profess Christianity. Because they have drifted so far by this time, there's a wide open door for Satan to bring his greatest deception ever on humanity. Verse 10, with all unrighteousness, deception among those who perish, because they did not have a love of the truth, that they might be saved. And for this reason, God will send them strong delusion, that they should believe the lie, that they all may be condemned who did not believe the truth, but had pleasure in unrighteousness. So it's a massive world test coming. It's a massive world test. At the same time, though, God will send 2 more prophets to warn the nations of what is upon the world. And there will be this clash of ideologies toward the end for 3.5 years, a clash of ideologies. And the people of the world will hate the two prophets that God sends. They'll hate them vehemently for exposing the unrighteousness of the world. Anyway, that's yet to come. Now, this lawless one, the man of sin, the son of perdition, God, as Paul called him, will actually claim to be Jesus Christ. We saw that a moment ago. Verse 4, he sits as God in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. And so, this great delusion will be something that the world will buy into. I was listening to a news report recently on other topics about things happening in the world, and it was brought to my attention that I think he's a French philosopher, Voltaire. He said, if you convince people of absurdities, they will commit atrocities. And I thought, wow, that's so true. And I went back and I looked up the reference to the literature where that was written by Voltaire. If you can convince people of absurdities, they will commit atrocities. And it's very reminiscent of 1935 through 1939 in Europe, when Nazi Germany was allowed to rise to such power that Adolf Hitler, when he got into his position of power, he very swiftly went and invaded other countries and took the Jews and put them in concentration camps and assassinated so many of his political opposers. And then he put Poles and Gypsies and Catholic priests and so many others in a horrible position, or killed them or put them in concentration camps. And people in Germany believed that he was doing the right thing. They believed in their leader. They believed in Adolf Hitler, that it was all good for, well, I mean, there were a few people that didn't, but they were afraid to speak by that point in time. And the Catholic Church was afraid to speak out at that time when Germany rose to such great power in Europe. So you can see how these things can happen even in our modern age. You can see these things being set up. So let's continue. On that note about lying signs and wonders, I'll just make a little promo for another sermon for another time that I plan to share with you. It will be titled, Will Mary Unite All Religions? When I talk about Mary, I'm talking about the Virgin Mary that's worshipped by millions of people around the world. And will Mary unite all religions? That's for another time. It's another sermon. But it may also tie into the last grand deception that Satan has in store for the world as he crafts his false religious beliefs. in a desperate measure to try to keep hold of everyone in the world worshiping him, virtually everyone. Now, this lawless one, the man of sin, I mentioned, he sits in a temple of God and claims that he himself is Christ. Now, does that mean necessarily that it is going to be a full construction of a third temple in Jerusalem? No, it doesn't. We're very open-minded on that, watching events. It could be, but it could also be just a place called the Holy Place, where we know that there will be sacrifices reinstituted in Jerusalem again for a period of time. It could be an altar. We don't know the final physical structure, but this is a person that in the holy place is always thought to be in Jerusalem, where this false prophet or the beast will make his stage his position, take his throne, if you will. If Mr. Bruce Rivers talked about thrones, and it can be a seat of power, it can mean several things in the Bible. Paul wrote about this individual, the beast, in other words, this man of sin, this would be the false prophet, several decades prior to when John wrote about this individual, meaning the Antichrist. So John may have had Paul's teachings in mind when he wrote about a particular coming Antichrist. Now, let's keep in mind that one beast of Revelation 13 and Revelation 16 is called, he is a civil authority. The second beast is a religious leader. Also an Antichrist. He is also the abomination that makes desolate, perhaps. So both are actually against the true Jesus Christ. And the second beast seems to very best fit the role of Antichrist spoken of by John. Our Life, Hope, and Truth article, there's an article by David Trabig, Mr. David Trabig, titled, "Will You Recognize the Antichrist?" I read it this morning. Will you recognize the Antichrist? A short article. Here's a quote from it. "What is amazing is that people's political freedom will be taken away, and they will be deceived into thinking that they are worshiping Christ. People will think that what they're doing is normal and good. After all, the economy will prosper. Major world problems will appear to be solved. Maybe nations will learn to put down arms, and there won't be the nuclear threats for a while, one nation against another. And right now, so many nations are arming for battle and for war. So many nations are heightening their military might right at this moment. But such is the nature of deception," the article says. "People who are deceived don't know that they're deceived." Now, in a Western society where the scientific method since the Renaissance has really started to dominate Western thought in schools, universities, that everything has to be tested empirically by some kind of proofs that something exists, and that you get people that do not believe that God exists simply because they can't prove it in a laboratory. They can't put it in a test tube and say, yeah, God exists, because those are spiritual matters. But so many people feel that are in the educated class, I'll put quotes around that only if something can be scientifically proven will they believe it. And this could play into a great setup for the world to be deceived. Now, let's talk about that just for a moment. Back to the Pew Research data. It showed that in countries all around the world where people have more education, they tend to have fewer churchgoers. And the Pew Research showed a number of graphs. The nations that are the poorest and that have the shortest lifespans and the least education are more likely to be churchgoers. It showed a huge contrast between sub-Saharan Africa, where Mozambique, Congo, Nigeria, Cameroon, Chad, some of the poorest nations on earth, have 70, 80, 90% of their population that attend church on a regular basis. And then you get into countries of Europe where they have very, very low church attendance. This is just one of many different factors. They find there are people that are more atheist and just have a disregard. They're more educated, they have more disregard for anything religious. We watch trends in these things. And I won't turn, but Daniel 12 verse 4 says this. Daniel 12 verse 4, at the close of a prophecy, it says, Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book until the time of the end. This is Jesus Christ speaking to Daniel in vision. Many will run to and fro, and knowledge shall increase. 1 Timothy 3 verse 1, Paul said, adds to this, 1 Timothy 3 verse 1, but know this, that in the last days perilous times will come. Verse 7, men will be always learning and never able to come to the knowledge of the truth. So knowledge will tremendously increase in the last days. Don't we know that? I mean, we see that technical knowledge is increasing without bound right now. I don't have the statistic, but it's breathtaking when you hear that every year so much more knowledge is being added to human store of knowledge. But it doesn't all mean it's the right knowledge. It's not all the best. What about all the false religious belief systems in the world? Well, we know that there exists a fundamental problem in the world of religion. Until it's resolved, we know that Jesus Christ spoke of a little flock, didn't he? He spoke of his true believers as a little flock, faithful believers, whereas the world as a whole will continue in the mass deception that it's been in for the last 6,000 years. But that it will reach a singularity. It will reach a certain singularity as Satan's restraint is removed. And as the technology and as the globalization and as the network of communication and the interchange of thought and language becomes one, Satan has a much, much bigger playground than he ever has in history. Back to Revelation 12, verse 7, if you'd like to join me. Revelation 12, verse 7. Revelation 12, verse 7. We know that this is the book of Revelation of Jesus Christ. It's a story of God's true church. It's a story that leads up to Christ's return to establish his kingdom and to cast off all other kingdoms on the earth. And it answers some questions that cannot be answered anywhere else in the Bible, this book of Revelation. Here in this verse, verse 7, we can see some of the nature, the motives, and the characteristics of Satan. Let's just read verses 7 through 9 of Revelation 12. War broke out in heaven. Michael and his angels fought with the dragon. The dragon and his angels fought, but they did not prevail, nor was a place found for them in heaven any longer. Let me pause right there. We see this as a conflict in the heavenly spirit realm at the end of the age. We don't get to see it. There's no rumbling. There's no earthquake. There's nothing we see in the sky. It's all in a spirit dimension. We think, well, we've taught this for a long time, that this is one of the conflicts, one of two that happens. And the first one was back before Satan was cast down to the earth, before Adam and Eve were placed in the garden. This would be a second conflict. And so no longer would Satan and his dragons be allowed, his demons be allowed to come up to heaven. Verse 9, so the great dragon was cast out, the serpent of old called the devil and Satan, who deceives the whole world. He was cast to the earth, and his angels were cast out with him. Now, verse 10, then I heard a loud voice in heaven, now salvation and strength and the kingdom of our God and the power of his Christ have come. For the accuser of our brethren, who accused them before God day and night, has been cast down. Here we have another indication of how Satan has done his ugly work of deceiving humankind, and who have accused the righteous and faithful people of God. There's this story of accusation, and James states it as the origin of wars that come from our carnal lusts. Verse 11, what did the saints do? And they overcame Satan by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony, and they did not love their lives to the death. They were able to resist with God's help, God's mercy, God's power to resist Satan and society that would hate God's people. And so Satan is involved in the persecution of the saints, but God gives them what they need to prevail. Verse 12, therefore rejoice, O heavens, and you who dwell in the heavens. Woe to the inhabitants of the earth and the sea, for the devil has come down to you, having great wrath, because he knows that he has a short time. We don't know what that short time is. We don't know that pivotal moment when he is banished once and for all from being able to go up into heaven and accuse the saints before God's throne. We don't know that point. But he comes with a great hatred and great hostility when he does. So the heavens will rejoice. And no longer is Satan given that privilege to come up to God's throne. But woe unto the inhabitants of the earth and the sea. Verse 13. Now when the dragon had seen it had been cast to the earth, he persecuted the woman, this time a faithful woman, the true church, who gave birth to the male child, who gave birth to Jesus Christ. Verse 14, but the woman was given 2 wings of a great eagle. Remember the symbolism. It's just a symbolic of a way of passage that she might fly into the wilderness, into her place, where she is nourished for a time and times and half a time from the presence of the serpent, 3.5 years. So the serpent spewed water out of his mouth like a flood after the woman, that he might cause her to be carried away by the flood. Other parts of the Bible, a flood can be a massive army of people kind of rolling over hills and landscape to attack a city or come from far away. So that imagery here is of a water flood. It's more than likely not water. Verse 16, but the earth helped the woman. The earth opened its mouth and swallowed up the flood, which the dragon had spewed out of its mouth. And the dragon was enraged with the woman, and he went to make war with the rest of her offspring, who keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus Christ. So some will be in a place of protection, a place of safety, and others God has designated will not be. This summarizes Satan's powerful spiritual control that causes the passions of division, hatred, accusation, persecution, and death. Now, we know there's no truth in Satan, as Jesus Christ spoke of. There's no truth in him. I mentioned earlier, he does not want the world to see his real identity. He would much rather the world just continue to bow down to false idols and their images. Back to that Life, Hope, and Truth article written by Mr. David Trebig. Will you recognize the Antichrist? This is a question. Will the Antichrist, or the man of sin, or the second beast, blatantly advocate rejection of God? Will it be that obvious? Breaking the first commandment, murder, breaking the sixth commandment, stealing, breaking the eighth commandment? Probably not. The article goes on to say it's probably not going to be that easy. Otherwise, why would it almost deceive the elect of God, this mass deception? It would be too obvious. Let me quote. It is more likely that the Antichrist will simply continue to break the laws of God that are commonly broken by many professing Christians today. Now, a vast majority of them don't know better. It's what they've been taught for generations, that Sunday is a day of worship, that Jesus Christ nailed the commandments of the cross, etc., etc., etc. But what are some of these laws? We're coming to a point in human history, again, where I think there's going to be a very distinct clash of ideologies between revealing what is true and right in the Bible against great forces that are trying to suppress that truth as it comes out. So the article says, God's law instructs us to keep the seventh-day Sabbath. Okay? Keep it holy and worship him on that day. The New Testament church observed it, of course. We're given much history of that. But most churches today consider Sunday their day of worship. That's one. Two, God's law instructs us to keep God's annual holy days and not to observe the pagan holidays. Instead of obeying God's commandments, most churches today have abandoned the biblical holy days and accepted in their place the celebrations of pagan origin, which we have today. Christmas, Easter, and so forth. God's law tells us not to make images or use in worship. Yet many of today's churches use pictures and statues as part of their religious practice. By breaking these often ignored laws of God, the Antichrist will indeed be the lawless one and the man of sin. But to nominal Christians who have not understood God's commandments, the Antichrist's conduct will seem normal. They will not suspect him of being a fraud. It's because they don't have a love of the truth that God allows this, and the world will fall into a mass deception. I was reading some basic beliefs of the world's largest religions. Let me quickly go through 3 or 4 of them here. This is from a Wikipedia article from 2020. That's the latest figures I have, 2020. Buddhism, about 500 million adherents. That's about 6.6% of the world's religious believers. What are their beliefs? Life is misery and decay. There's no ultimate destiny or reality in it or behind it. The cycle of endless birth and rebirth continues because of desire and attachment to the unreal self. I know. I don't know what that means. I have clueless. What does it mean? But their solutions to the human condition in Buddhism is right meditation and deeds will end the cycle of constant birth, death, reincarnation over and over and over again, and people will achieve nirvana, the void, meaning the total absence of feeling. Doesn't sound very enticing, does it? Not really. The Buddhists are looking for the 5th Buddha to arrive on the world scene, a 5th Buddha. Keep this thought in mind. You're going to see a string of commonalities here. Next, Hinduism. 1.2 billion adherents. 15% of all the religious believers in the world. 1.2 billion. What do they believe? Hinduism is hard to define. It has no founder, no common creed, no one doctrine to bind Hindus together. Intellectually, there is complete freedom of belief. One can be monotheist, polytheist, or atheist. You can believe in one God, multiple gods, or no God at all. Life in all its forms is an aspect of the divine, but it appears as a separation from the divine, a meaningless cycle of birth and rebirth. In other words, reincarnation again. I don't know the details. I apologize. I just don't know. What are they looking for? The Hindus are looking for Krishna, one of their gods, one of their thousands of gods. Hindus are looking for Krishna. Islam, 1.6 billion adherents, 23%. Or 1 out of 4 people that have religious beliefs in the world. Monotheistic, yes, it is monotheistic, and they claim their roots back to Abraham, just like Judaism and Christianity, back to Abraham. To them, God revealed truth through the Quran. They believe those who repent and sincerely submit to God, Allah in their case, return to a state of sinlessness. In the end, they go to a paradise, a place of physical and spiritual pleasure, and the wicked will burn in hellfire. What are they looking for? The Muslims are looking for the 12th Imam to come on the scene. Someone to a religious leader called the 12th Imam. Do you see a trend going on here? The list goes on. Non-Christian religions and much smaller groups include Confucianism, Kwanzaa, Shinto, other Baha'i, Wicca, Taoism, Santeria, and there are only, there are about 9% of the world's rest of those groups that are adherents to those. Now, Judaism is very interesting. You would think of it as being a dominant religious following in the world as far as population. 1/5 of 1%. 1/5 of 1%. 0.18% of the world's 6.6 billion people, or whatever it is, embraces Judaism. I would have thought it was more, but I've checked this again and again. And so that's a very small group, and we know what they believe. Christianity, professing Christianity by far is the largest group of religious adherents. Between 1.5 and 2.1 billion people. And, of course, we know that somewhere off that radar screen is a small group of true believers called Jesus Christ refers to as his little flock. But what are they looking for? They're looking for Christ's return. And Jesus Christ warned his disciples, didn't he? Don't listen when people say he's hiding in this compartment, or he's over there, he's here, or there. And of course, I talked recently about the great mass deception that many evangelical Christians have set themselves up for, mostly in the United States, as far as that teaching goes, the rapture theory, that Christians that were faithful will be swept away, raptured away by an invisible returning Jesus Christ that swoops down close to the earth and takes the saints up to heaven until the end of the Great Tribulation. And then he comes back again. So that is leading up to be a tremendous disappointment in my estimation too. But now, as we start to draw to a close, let me give you several indicators to watch. Earlier this month, November 6th, I gave a sermon here titled A Time to Watch Closely. And I gave 3 indicators in prophecy. Watch for developments in the last revival of the Holy Roman Empire. Watch for reinstitution of sacrifices in Jerusalem, in the holy place, as God designates. Watch how the gospel will continue to be preached in all the world. Those were 3 indicators I left you with. I have 3 more. I have 3 more today. Indicator number 1 is called world ecumenism. World ecumenism, in its broadest sense, this unity or cooperation of religions around the world is being pushed hard by the Roman Catholic Pope right now, and other organizations in Protestant Christianity and other religions as well. But it's this cooperation and unity that for 500 years the Protestant side of Christianity and the Roman Catholic side of Christianity have had a very sharp division for 500 years since the Reformation. And now there's this putting away the old animosities and trying to bury the hatchet and remove all the things that made them hate each other, if you will, or separate from each other. And so we're seeing this greater sense of shared spirituality between the 3 Abrahamic faiths: Judaism, Christianity, and the Islam. And so the Roman Catholic Church not only describes itself as the mother of Christianity, but also has figuratively given birth to a numerous daughter churches, as was prophesied in the book of Revelation. These are the Eastern Orthodox Church in Eastern Europe, Protestant denominations all around the world. They all trace their roots back to Rome and to the Romish Church of Rome. This is why the current Pope, Pope Francis, Jorge Mario Bergoglio, has been a promoter of ecumenism since he has taken office. He's been a big promoter of it. Before him, Pope John Paul II, he was also a very strong advocate of ecumenism, getting the world's religions to cooperate, to work together. Here's a definition in Wikipedia. the concept and principle in which Christians who belong to different Christian denominations work together to develop closer relationships and promote Christian unity. So, indicator number 1, watch for world ecumenism progress. Number 2 out of 3, Sunday worship being globally enforced. Watch for that. It's something we've taught for many years. Watch for Sunday worship being globally enforced. I mentioned Pope John Paul II. It was back in 1998 while he was the Pope. He issued an apostolic letter about Sunday keeping titled The Lord's Day, which has important implication for Sabbath observers. In his papal letter, John Paul appealed to the authority of the fourth commandment, God's true Sabbath commandment, to give legitimacy to Sunday keeping. He also advocated civil enforcement for a Sunday rest. Now, that hasn't gained global traction yet, but he was a strong advocate of global enforcement of a Sunday day of worship. Shut down all industry, shut down all commerce, and take Sunday as a day of rest and probably worship. Now, this is something to be watching. I mentioned that there was in the 1500s the Protestant split. The Martin Luther had nailed his 95 theses, a different list of items that he addressed the Catholic Church he felt were desperately wrong with their teachings. He saw doctrinal differences. He was an Augustine monk. He didn't want to leave the Catholic Church. He was just trying to get their attention to reform. Well, he was cast off, and of course we know that Luther became a reformer that would break from the Catholic Church, and there were many others that would follow. And since the 16th century, 1500s, Protestants have continued to protest even among themselves. The Baptists, the Methodists, the Presbyterians, and so forth, and splinter into thousands of denominations. In recent decades, they too have tried to reduce their differences and look for unity between them, the things they hold in common. And so fewer and fewer Christians are seeing such sharp differences between Protestants and Catholics as has been held for 500 years. Now, some of the interesting things that are actually quite shocking to conservative Catholics that Pope Francis, the current Pope, has made since 2013 when he took office. And again, he serves up to 1.2 billion Roman Catholics. He has made great efforts to reach out to Protestants. He has recognized Protestant churches as valid paths to salvation. That was never the case 100 years ago when the Catholic Church felt if you were not baptized a Catholic, you would not be in heaven. That was their strong stance. And now they call Protestants separate brothers or separated brothers. And so here are some of his statements. July 2013, if a gay person seeks God, who am I to judge him? Says Pope Francis. September 2013, Pope Francis assures atheists, you don't have to believe in God to go to heaven. This is the Pope of the Catholic Church, okay? He's also considered the most ecumenical Pope in history because of his efforts in trying to enjoin faiths together. September 2015, he blends environmental and ecumenical agendas in a day of national or world prayer. World prayer. January 2016, in first prayer video, Pope stresses, this is a headline, Pope stresses interfaith unity, saying we are all children of God. So once again, number 2 was to be watching for an enforcement of Sunday worship. Number 3 out of 3. Indicator number 3, to be watching for the lying signs and wonders. Lying signs and wonders. Spiritualism is on the rise. What is that? In a nutshell, it's where people claim to have the ability to speak to departed relatives, to dead people, to gain insights and wisdom that is permeated Protestantism. When you go to a Protestant funeral and the minister stands up at the lectern, the podium, and he says, he's looking down from heaven at us and he's praying for us. And I mean, these things are just absolutely non-biblical, and yet it's so sad that people are being taught this for decade after decade after decade. So they're really speaking with demons if they have a true conversation with some other spirit, shall we say. And then there are a lot of fakers out there too. There are a lot of phonies, people that will pretend like they can speak to the dead, conjure up the dead. Virgin Mary makes intercession for God's people. This belief is especially strong in the mainly Catholic nations of the world, Europe, South and Central America. And the former Pope, Pope John Paul II, elevated Mary even higher than previous popes did before him. In a 1995 Catholic publication, he said, "The veneration of Mary, which unites East and West so intimately," meaning the Eastern Orthodox religion and the Western Roman Catholic Church, "so intimately, will serve, I am convinced, the cause of unity. The Most Holy Virgin continuously speaks of unity for which she constantly intercedes," making intercession for humanity from heaven, supposedly. So you see some of these elements, even though Pope John Paul II died, and these elements are still marching ever so slowly forward in false religion. And so, again, Paul rightly said, 1 Corinthians 10, verse 20, that people are actually worshiping demons when they bow down to idols. He says, rather, that the things which the Gentiles sacrifice, they sacrifice to demons and not to God. I'm going to close with a conclusion here. What strong admonition and what hope do we have? Luke 21, verse 29. Let's turn there, and then I'll finish up with one in Revelation. Luke 21, verse 29. This is the parallel to the Olivet prophecy in Matthew 24. Luke 21, verses 29 through 36. He was answering his disciples on the questions they asked in the Olivet prophecy. Then he spoke to them a parable. Look at the fig tree and all the trees. Verse 30. When they are already budding, you see and you know for yourselves that summer is near. It's a very simple observation. Verse 31. So you also, when you see these things happening, the things he listed before this verse, of the very rapid, brief outline of end-time events, he says, know that the kingdom of God is near. Verse 32, assuredly I say to you, this generation will by no means pass away till all things take place. The generation he is speaking about, that generation. Verse 33, heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will by no means pass away. Take heed to yourselves, lest your hearts be weighed down with carousing, drunkenness, and the cares of this life, and that day come upon you unexpectedly. For it will come as a snare on all those who dwell on the face of the whole earth. Watch therefore and pray always, that you may be counted worthy to escape all these things that shall come to pass, and to stand boldly before the Son of God in the day. So, you've heard me cite that passage many times now, since my wife and I have enjoyed being in your fellowship. Let's go to Revelation 20, verse 1 for one final passage, and I'll close with it. Revelation 20, verse 1. This is the final part of John's vision regarding the end of this age and the conclusion of the matter for Christ's disciples who are watching and praying and always staying ready, spiritually speaking. Verses 1 through 6. Then I saw an angel coming down from heaven, having the key to the bottomless pit. and a great chain in his hand. He laid hold of the dragon, that serpent of old, who is the devil and Satan, and he bound him for 1,000 years. And he cast him into the bottomless pit and shut him up and set a seal on him so that he should deceive the nations no more till the 1,000 years was finished. But after these things he must be released for a short while. That's another whole topic. Verse 4, and I saw thrones. Mr. Bruce Rivers quoted Revelation 3:21 about the thrones that are being held and preserved for God's faithful people who overcome. It says, Revelation 3:21, to him who overcomes I will grant to sit with me on my throne. Well, let's read verse 4 here in Revelation 20. And I saw thrones, and they sat on them, and judgment was committed to them. Then I saw the souls of those who had been beheaded for their witness to Jesus and for the word of God, who had not worshipped the beast or his image, and had not received his mark on their foreheads or on their hands. Remember, the forehead symbolizes, the mark on the forehead is not a literal mark. It's not likely to be. It's more or less an oath of allegiance to a ideology or system. The mark on the hand is more than likely the industry, the work, the labor, the human activity side of believing in this system. So no mark on the foreheads or on their hands. They lived and reigned with Christ for 1,000 years. Verse 6, skipping to verse 6, blessed and holy is he who has part in the first resurrection. Over such the second death has no power, but they shall be priests of God and of Christ, and shall reign with him for 1,000 years. And then the parenthetical verse 5, which is kind of out of place. That's why I just read verse 6. Verse 5 says, but the rest of the dead did not live again until the 1,000 years were finished. This is the first resurrection for the saints, and then the second resurrection for the rest of the dead. Now, we have been given a rare privilege of understanding so much of an outline of God's great plan of salvation. What a blessing we have. And vast numbers who have been purposely not called in this age, so that there will be a future time when you and I will assist them in understanding God's way of life, and billions God plans to invite to take part in eternity. And so we're very thankful. Keep the faith, and may God bless all of you.